What if I told you that your country's debt was never meant to be paid off? Not because your government is incompetent, not because politicians are corrupt, well, not only because of that, but because the entire financial system that every modern nation operates inside of was designed from the very beginning so that debt would be the permanent, unavoidable condition of every country on Earth. Cut to sweeping aerial shots of Washington, D.C., London, Tokyo, and Nairobi. Think about that for a second. The United States owes over $34 trillion. Japan's debt is over 260% of its GDP, meaning it owes more than twice the value of everything it produces in a year. The United Kingdom, France, Italy, Brazil, every single one of them is drowning in debt that grows every single year, regardless of which party is in power, regardless of whether the economy is booming or collapsing. And yet, here's the mystery: none of them go bankrupt. None of the banks that lent them money demand repayment. The system keeps running. The debts keep growing. And every year, governments borrow more money just to pay the interest on the money they already borrowed. So who is this system actually working for? And more importantly, who built it? Stay with me, because the answer goes back further than you think, involves a small group of men in a room that most people have never heard of, and ultimately explains something you see in the news every single day, even if you've never connected the dots. This is the hidden system that keeps every nation permanently in debt. To understand how the trap was built, you have to go back to a time before the trap existed, before the year 1694 for most of human history. When a king needed money for a war, for a palace, for a famine, he had a few options. He could tax his people, he could seize the assets of his enemies, or he could borrow from wealthy merchants and nobles. And here was the critical difference from today. When a king borrowed money, he borrowed existing money, real gold, real silver, coins that someone else had earned, saved, and agreed to hand over. That meant borrowing had a natural limit. Lenders ran out of coins, and kings, embarrassingly, sometimes just refused to pay them back, which is actually one of the reasons medieval banking was such a risky business. Edward III of England defaulted on loans from Florentine banks in 1345, collapsing two of Europe's largest financial dynasties. But then came 1694, and everything changed. England was at war, again, this time with France under King Louis XIV. The crown was broke. Tax revenues were exhausted, and a Scottish financier named William Paterson walked into a room with a proposal so audacious it almost defies belief. His idea was simple on the surface: form a private bank, let it lend the government £1.2 million, and in exchange, give this bank the extraordinary privilege of issuing its own banknotes, paper money, backed not by gold sitting in a vault, but by the promise of the government to repay. King William III signed it into law, and just like that, the Bank of England was born. Now, here is the part most history textbooks gloss over. The Bank of England was not a government bank. It was a private institution, owned by private shareholders, that lent money to the government at interest. Which meant the government of England, from that day forward, was permanently in debt to a private institution. And to repay the interest on that debt, it had to keep borrowing more. And to borrow more, it had to keep giving the Bank of England more power. The trap was set. What Paterson had invented wasn't just a bank. He had invented the debt-based monetary system, a system in which money itself is created at the moment of borrowing, and can only exist as long as someone, somewhere, owes a debt. And over the next 3 centuries, that system would spread quietly, methodically, almost invisibly, to every corner of the planet. The Bank of England model was so profitable for its shareholders, and so useful for governments who wanted to fund wars without raising taxes immediately, that it was replicated almost everywhere within 150 years. In 1800, Napoleon established the Banque de France. In 1816, the United States set up the Second Bank of the United States, though not without a vicious political fight. Andrew Jackson, one of the only U.S. presidents to ever pay off the national debt entirely, called the central bank a den of vipers and killed it in 1833. But the bank always came back. Why? Because governments discovered a seductive truth. Borrowing from a central bank meant you could spend money you didn't have right now and worry about the consequences later. And for politicians facing elections, Later, it was always someone else's problem. Fast forward to November 1910, a private rail car departs from a New Jersey station late at night. The curtains are drawn. The passengers use only first names. They are some of the most powerful bankers in America, representatives of the Morgan, Rockefeller, and Rothschild financial empires. They are heading to Jekyll Island, Georgia, for a secret meeting that will last 9 days. The man who organized the trip was Senator Nelson Aldrich, chairman of the Senate's Finance Committee, and father-in-law to John D. Rockefeller Jr. The most influential financial mind in the room was Paul Warburg, a German-born banker who had spent years studying the central banking models of Europe and desperately wanted to bring them to America. These men drafted the legislation that would become the Federal Reserve. Act of 1913, the Federal Reserve was sold to the American public as a tool to stabilize the economy, prevent bank panics, and protect the average citizen from the boom-bust cycles that had devastated households in 1873, 1893, and 1907. What it actually created was the permanent infrastructure for government, debt dependency. Here's the mechanism, and pay close attention, because this is the engine of the entire system. When the U.S. government needs money it doesn't have, it issues treasury bonds, essentially IOUs. The Federal Reserve then purchases those bonds by doing something remarkable. It creates new money electronically, from nothing, at that very moment. The government gets spendable dollars. The Fed holds the bonds, and the government owes the Fed plus interest. So where does the money to pay the interest come from? The government has to issue more bonds, which the Fed purchases with more newly created money, which creates more interest owed, which requires more bonds. It is by mathematical design, a cycle that can never close. For decades after 1913, there was at least a partial break on this system. Under the Bretton Woods Agreement of 1944, signed by 44 nations after World War II, the U.S. dollar was tied to gold at $35 per ounce, and other currencies were tied to the dollar. This meant there was a theoretical ceiling on how much money could be created. But then came August 15, 1971, a Sunday evening. President Richard Nixon appeared on national television and made an announcement that changed the global financial order forever. He was ending the convertibility of the U.S. dollar to gold permanently. What became known as the Nixon shock untethered every currency on earth from any physical constraint. Money was now pure abstraction. It was worth whatever the government said it was worth, backed by nothing but trust in the institution that issued it. Economists called this the shift to fiat currency. What it really meant was the printing press had no speed limit anymore, and governments knew it. Look at a chart of U.S. national debt from 1776 to today. From 1776 to 1971, nearly 2 centuries, the debt rose, rose during wars, fell after them. It had a rhythm. It behaved like debt that was meant to eventually be repaid. After 1971, the line goes vertical. No war, no recession, no boom could stop it. The debt grew under Reagan. It grew under Clinton, despite a budget surplus, because that surplus only referred to the annual budget, not the accumulated debt. It doubled under Bush, doubled again under Obama, grew explosively under Trump and Biden. And this wasn't unique to America. After 1971, every nation that adopted the fiat currency model, which was eventually, every nation began the same journey. Global debt today stands at over $300 trillion, more than 3 times the entire annual economic output of the entire planet. Let that sink in. The world owes 3 times more than it earns in a year, and that number is rising every single second. History is littered with attempts to break out of this cycle, and they have all, in different ways, failed or been crushed. Greece, 2010. Forced into austerity by the IMF and European creditors. The government slashed pensions, cut wages, raised taxes. The economy contracted by 25%, a depression-level collapse. The debt as a percentage of GDP increased because the economy shrank faster than the debt did. Argentina. Each time, it was locked out of global credit markets, plunging its citizens into poverty, until it agreed to new loan conditions that inevitably created new debt. It is currently in its 9th debt restructuring program with the IMF. Iceland, 2008. The one country that broke the script. After its banking system collapsed, Iceland let the banks fail, jailed the bankers, and refused the IMF's standard prescription. Its economy recovered within 5 years. But Iceland is a nation of 370,000 people. The pressure it faced would be multiplied 1,000-fold for a G7 economy. Every time a nation seriously threatens to exit the debt system, the mechanisms of global finance, bond markets, credit ratings, currency speculators align to make the pain so severe that the government backs down or falls. You might be thinking, this is history. Things are different now. They are not. In 2023, the United States paid $659 billion just in interest on its national debt. Not paying down the debt, not funding schools or roads, just the interest. That figure is now larger than the entire U.S. defense budget Japan has been running. Near zero or negative interest rates for over 2 decades, because the moment it raises rates, the interest payments on its debt would consume an impossible share of government revenue. It is, in the bluntest terms, a nation that cannot afford to have normal interest rates. The European Central Bank, the Bank of Japan, the Federal Reserve, they all engaged in a policy called quantitative easing after 2008, buying their own government's bonds with newly created money. The combined balance sheets of the world's major central banks grew from roughly $5 trillion in 2007 to over $28 trillion by 2022. They created $23 trillion in 15 years. And the result wasn't growth. It was asset price inflation. The rich got richer because they owned stocks and property, while wages stagnated and the cost of living rose for everyone. Else, and here is the cruel geometry at the center of the whole machine, the debt system transfers wealth upward. When a government borrows and spends, the interest flows to the holders of government bonds, which are disproportionately banks, hedge funds, sovereign wealth funds, and the ultra-wealthy. The debt is serviced by taxes, paid by everyone. The interest is collected by the few. It was this way in 1694. It is this way today. So we've traveled from a secret meeting on a Georgia island in 1910 to $300 trillion in global debt in the present day. What do you actually do with this information? 3 things take away. 1. Understand that national debt is not a mistake. It is a feature. When politicians promise to reduce the deficit, they mean they want to slow the growth of the debt. Almost no serious political figure anywhere in the world is proposing to actually eliminate national debt. Because under the current monetary system, eliminating debt would require eliminating most of the money supply. The debt and the money are 2 sides of the same coin. Literally. Takeaway 2. The inflation you feel every day is a direct consequence of this system. Every time a central bank creates new money to purchase government bonds, the existing money in your wallet and your savings account is diluted. This is not an accident or a side effect. It is the hidden tax. It is the mechanism by which the cost of government borrowing is silently spread across every person who holds the currency. You are paying for the debt even if you've never borrowed a cent. Takeaway 3. Reform is structurally resisted, not just politically difficult. The reason meaningful monetary reform never happens isn't simply that politicians are cowards, though some are. It's that the institutions that benefit from the current system, the largest banks, the primary dealers, the bond markets, are the same institutions that governments depend on to fund their operations. A government that threatens the system gets punished by the market. Its borrowing costs go up. Its currency weakens. The medicine is so painful that reform becomes politically suicidal before it can ever become law. Here is the open question no economists, mainstream or otherwise, has been able to answer satisfactorily. What happens when the interest payments become so large that governments can no longer credibly service them, even with new borrowing? When the bond market stops believing that the debt will ever be managed, let alone repaid, history has answers, and they are not comfortable. Weimar Germany, 1923, Zimbabwe, 2008, Venezuela, 2016. In each case, the government printed money to cover debts it couldn't pay in any other way. In each case, the currency collapsed. Savings were obliterated. The middle class was wiped out in a matter of months. Now those were smaller economies with fewer options. The United States, the EU, Japan, they have tools and reserves those countries never had. But tools delay consequences. They don't eliminate them. The U.S. national debt is growing by roughly $1 trillion every 100 days. At what point does too big to fail become too big to save? That question doesn't have an answer yet, but the fact that it's being asked quietly, seriously, by some of the most respected economists in the world should tell you something. The system has never been tested at this scale, not once in human history. And the experiment is running in real time with your savings, your wages, and your children's fiscal future as the variables. If this video made something click for you, if you've watched the news and sensed that something was off but couldn't quite name it, then share it. Because this is the kind of understanding that very few people have, and that almost nobody teaches in school. It isn't run by shadowy figures twirling mustaches in underground lairs. It's a set of legal structures, incentive mechanisms, and institutional dependencies that evolved over 3 centuries and now runs on autopilot. But autopilot is not destiny. Understanding a system is the first step to imagining something different. If you want to go deeper, there's a follow-up video on what alternatives have actually been tried, from gold standards to modern monetary theory to cryptocurrency, and why none of them have fully solved the problem yet. That video is right here. And if you're new to this channel, subscribe, because this is exactly the kind of question we spend our time on. The hidden architecture of the world you already live in.